The Mafia boss came home early and almost fainted when he saw what his black maid was doing. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun was beginning to set as Dominic Valentino's black SUV rolled through the gates of his mansion. The long driveway, flanked by perfectly manicured hedges and towering oak trees, led to the grand entrance of his estate. His mind was occupied with the business dealings of the day, the quiet power struggles, the money that flowed like water through the veins of his empire. But there was something else on his mind, something that had been weighing on him for weeks. His maid, a woman named Lila. She was quiet, reserved, and always in the background, doing her job without causing a stir. But lately, he'd caught glimpses of something more in her, something he couldn't quite place. He didn't know why he felt this way, but for some reason, his thoughts kept drifting to her, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. As the car came to a stop, he noticed the windows of the mansion were slightly ajar, the lights spilling out onto the perfectly paved walkway. He wasn't expected back until much later, but something had prompted him to return early. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly 6. Just in time for dinner, he thought. But as he stepped out of the car and made his way toward the front door, he noticed something unusual. There, just inside the entryway, Lila was standing, her back to him. She seemed unaware of his arrival. But it wasn't her presence that shocked him, it was what she was doing. She was standing over a large, open suitcase, packing it with what seemed like personal belongings. It wasn't her belongings either. It was a child's clothing, toys, and small, well-worn items that looked familiar. His heart skipped a beat as he realized what he was seeing. The suitcase wasn't hers. It was a child's. A child she had been secretly caring for. His mind raced as he took another step closer. How long had she been hiding this from him? What was going on here? Before he could think another thought, Lila turned, startled by the sound of his footsteps on the marble floor. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, she froze, as if caught in the act. Dominic's jaw tightened, a mixture of confusion and something else flooding his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he watched as Lila quickly zipped up the suitcase, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I didn't hear you come in," she whispered, avoiding his gaze. I wasn't expecting you yet." Dominic stood still, his eyes scanning the room. He had never seen her like this before. The maid, usually so composed and proper, now seemed vulnerable, caught in a web of her own secrets. His mind tried to process what he was seeing. The child, the suitcase, what was all of this? The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, Dominic walked forward, his voice low and steady. "What's going on here, Lila?" Lila didn't answer immediately. She glanced at the suitcase and then back at him, her hands trembling slightly. I wasn't hiding anything, Dominic. I was packing for someone." She cleared her throat, trying to steady her voice. "A child I've been helping." Dominic's eyes narrowed. "A child?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, still not meeting his gaze. "Yes," she said softly. "I've been taking care of him. He's my nephew. His parents, they're in trouble. I couldn't leave him alone." Dominic's heart pounded in his chest. He had always known Lila was different from the other staff members. She had an air of quiet strength about her, a sense of loyalty that was unshakable. But this was something else entirely. He wasn't sure what to think or feel, but one thing was clear. Lila had been hiding a secret, and it had changed everything. He stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of the situation. Then, his eyes softened, and he took another step closer. "You didn't have to do this alone," he said, his voice low but steady. "You should have come to me." Lila looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't want to burden you," she said softly. "I didn't want to make things complicated." Dominic exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice filled with an unexpected warmth. "We'll figure it out together." The tension between them seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of understanding, of something deeper than he had ever expected to feel for her. In that moment, Dominic Valentino realized that the woman standing before him was not just the maid he had hired. She was something far more important. And as the weight of the situation sank in, he knew that nothing would ever be the same between them again. Dominic stood there for a moment, his hand still resting on Lila's shoulder. The words she had just spoken had shattered the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself, but he couldn't seem to pull away. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just learned. Lila, the quiet, humble maid he had hired months ago, was hiding a child in his mansion. His mind couldn't comprehend the depth of the situation. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something raw, something far beyond the duties of a servant. There was fear, desperation, and most of all, loyalty. Lila wasn't just taking care of a child. She was fighting for him, for his future. And he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He had to act. Without thinking, Dominic stepped closer, his voice steady and calm as he spoke. "We need to talk." Lila nodded, her shoulders slumping with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding in until the weight of his words began to settle. "I'll explain everything, Dominic," she whispered. "But please, you have to understand. I couldn't let him stay in the system. He's family." Dominic nodded, his eyes still searching hers. "I get it," he said quietly. "But there's more at stake now. We can't keep this hidden forever." He paused, a heavy silence hanging between them. "You need to be careful, Lila. If anyone finds out, it could cost us everything." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She had known the risks, but hearing Dominic say it out loud made it feel more real. The fear she had been trying to suppress came rushing back. She had never expected her quiet life in this mansion to unravel like this. But she couldn't back down now. "I know," she replied, her voice shaking. "I've been careful, but I can't let him go back to where he was. I've already lost so much." Her voice trailed off, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, remembering the child she had lost years ago. The pain still lingered, a shadow that never quite faded. Dominic saw the anguish in her eyes and felt a pang in his chest. He had never understood the depth of her sorrow until now, and it changed everything. He knew what it was like to lose someone. He knew the lengths people would go to in order to protect those they loved. "I won't let anyone hurt him," Dominic said firmly. "Or you." He took a step back, his gaze hardening. "I'll handle this. But you need to trust me, Lila. We're in this together now." Lila looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She had never imagined that the man she had served would stand by her like this. "You mean it?" she asked softly. "You'll help?" Dominic met her gaze, his expression serious. "I don't make promises I can't keep," he said. "But I'm not going to let you do this alone. We'll figure it out." Lila's breath caught in her throat, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. Hope that things could be different. Hope that, maybe, she wouldn't have to carry the burden of this secret alone anymore. As the weight of his words sank in, she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. Dominic gave a single, curt nod before turning and heading toward the door. "Stay here," he ordered. "I'll make sure everything's taken care of." Lila watched him go, her heart racing with uncertainty and a strange sense of relief. She had just taken the first step towards something she hadn't dared to dream of, a future where she didn't have to hide. But as the door closed behind him, a new wave of fear washed over her. She didn't know what Dominic's plan was, but she knew one thing for sure. Things were never going to be the same again. In the days that followed, Dominic worked tirelessly, using his connections and his power to make sure Lila and the child would be safe. He had underestimated how far he would go to protect them, but once the decision was made, there was no turning back. Lila kept to herself, never straying far from the small quarters she had been given, her thoughts constantly on the child who had been entrusted to her care. She had watched him grow over the past few months, seen the light return to his eyes after the dark days of his past. But now, that light was in danger of being extinguished again. Late one night, as she sat in the quiet of the mansion, she heard footsteps approaching. Dominic entered the room, his face grim. "We have a problem," he said, his voice low. Lila's heart skipped a beat. "What happened?" she asked, standing quickly. Dominic looked at her, his expression hard. "Someone knows," he said simply. "Someone is getting too close. We need to move fast." Lila felt her blood run cold. "But how?" she whispered. Dominic stepped forward, his gaze intense. "I'm going to make sure he's safe," he said, his voice filled with determination. No one will touch him. Not as long as I'm here. Lila nodded, her mind racing. She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back now. But as the weight of the situation pressed down on her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change everything. The tension in the mansion grew thick with each passing hour. Lila couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep inside her since Dominic had warned her of the danger. She sat quietly in her quarters, her thoughts racing. The child, now fast asleep in the small room next to hers, was the only thing on her mind. He had already suffered too much, and she wasn't about to let anyone take him from her now. The stakes were higher than ever, but she felt a strange sense of determination. Dominic had promised to protect them both, and for the first time since she had started caring for the boy, Lila allowed herself to hope. Outside, the mansion stood in eerie silence, its walls hiding the secrets of the night. It was as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She heard the footsteps again, Dominic's unmistakable gait as he moved through the hallways. Lila stood up quickly, smoothing out her clothes. Her pulse quickened as she wondered what new development had forced him to come back here again, so soon after their last conversation. The door creaked open, and Dominic stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room with intensity. "We need to move," he said quietly, his voice low but urgent. Lila's heart sank. "What happened?" "Who knows?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic closed the door behind him and walked towards her, the weight of the situation heavy in his every step. "It's the neighbors," he replied. "One of them saw something they shouldn't have. They're asking questions, and we can't afford that right now." Lila's stomach twisted into knots. She had feared this moment would come, but hearing it out loud made everything feel too real. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dominic paused for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. For the briefest second, she saw something more than the Mafia boss, the man who had protected her, the man who had shown her kindness. He was torn, as if the weight of everything was finally catching up to him. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold resolve that defined him. "I'll take care of it," he said. "But we need to leave tonight. No more waiting." Lila nodded, her mind reeling. She had no idea what Dominic had planned, but she trusted him. The suddenness of it all left her no room for doubt. If he said it had to be done, then it had to be done. As she followed him through the mansion's quiet halls, Lila's thoughts went back to the child. She had kept him hidden for so long, protected him from the world. But now, the world was closing in. They were both at risk. "I won't let them take him," she whispered to herself, more to reassure herself than anyone else. Dominic glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "No one will take him. Not while I'm here." The words were spoken with the calm certainty that Lila had come to rely on. They made their way toward the back of the mansion, where Dominic's private garage was located. The cold night air hit Lila's face as they stepped outside, the car waiting for them in the shadows. Dominic's driver was already in the front seat, the engine running. Dominic turned to Lila. "Get in," he ordered, his voice firm. Lila hesitated for a moment, looking back at the mansion that had been her home for so long. It felt like she was leaving a part of herself behind, but she knew it was the only choice. She climbed into the car, the door closing behind her with a soft click. As they sped away from the mansion, Lila glanced out the window, her mind still racing. What was Dominic going to do? Who had seen them? She had no answers, only questions. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Dominic turned to her, his face illuminated by the soft light from the dashboard. "We're going to a safe house," he replied. "I've already made arrangements." Lila nodded, trying to calm the swirling thoughts in her mind. She could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. The child was still asleep, unaware of the danger that was closing in on them. As they drove through the streets of the city, Lila couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep this hidden. It felt like the walls were closing in, and no matter how much Dominic tried to protect them, the truth would eventually come to light. But for now, all she could do was trust him. As the car drove deeper into the city, the streets grew quieter, the lights dimmer. Finally, they reached a secluded area, where a small, inconspicuous house sat at the end of a narrow street. The house was modest, nothing like the mansion they had just left, but to Lila, it felt like a safe haven. They pulled into the driveway, and Dominic got out first, checking the surroundings. Lila followed him, her heart still racing. The door opened, and an older man with a thick beard and worn clothes greeted them. "Everything's ready," he said, his voice gruff. "Come inside." Lila stepped into the house, the warmth from the fireplace wrapping around her. She looked back at Dominic, who was already speaking to the man, discussing their next steps. She felt a momentary sense of peace. For the first time since the child had come into her life, it felt like they might be safe. But even as she tried to relax, the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach wouldn't go away. How long would this last? How long before their lives were turned upside down again? As the door shut behind her, Lila took a deep breath. She had made it this far. She had to believe that they would be okay. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. Lila barely slept, her mind constantly racing with the implications of what was happening. The child, now safely tucked away in the small house Dominic had arranged for them, seemed oblivious to the danger surrounding them. To him, everything was just an adventure, a new place to explore. To Lila, it was a fragile moment of peace that she knew could be shattered at any time. She spent her days keeping to herself, quietly watching over the child, while Dominic took care of business in the shadows. She had no idea what he was doing, only that he had promised to protect them both. His word had to be enough. But even as the days passed, the tension remained. Every small sound, every knock on the door, sent Lila's heart racing. The world outside felt like it was closing in, and she knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. It was just a matter of time before someone found them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dominic returned to the house. His expression was darker than usual, his jaw tight with frustration. Lila looked up from where she had been sitting with the child, her heart skipping a beat. "What happened?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked past her and stood by the window, his eyes scanning the street outside as if waiting for something. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "We have a problem," he said, his words carrying the weight of something much worse than just a setback. Lila felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Dominic turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of regret and resolve. "Someone's been asking about you," he said. "Not just anyone, someone who knows more than they should." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She knew what that meant. "Who?" she asked, trying to steady herself. Dominic's expression hardened. "I don't know yet," he replied. "But we need to move again. We can't stay here." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the promise of more danger. Lila's mind raced. "Where will we go?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, his eyes softening just slightly. "I've got a place," he said. "It's secure. It's the best we can do right now." Lila nodded, though her heart was still heavy with uncertainty. She had trusted Dominic before, but now, as the walls seemed to close in around them, that trust was being tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. "We leave now," Dominic said firmly, cutting off any further questions. Lila didn't argue. She stood up quickly, her thoughts on the child, who had been playing quietly in the corner. He didn't understand the gravity of the situation, but Lila knew that as long as he was with her, he would be safe. She reached down and gently took his hand, leading him toward the door. "Come on, sweetie," she said softly, her voice calm despite the storm brewing inside her. As they left the house, Lila couldn't help but glance back one last time, wondering how much longer they could keep running. The night air was cool against her skin as they made their way to the car, where Dominic was already waiting. The moment they climbed into the back seat, the car sped off into the darkness. Lila watched as the familiar streets of the city disappeared behind them, replaced by the unknown. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest, suffocating her with each passing mile. What would happen if they were caught? What would happen if they couldn't outrun their past? "Where are we going?" Lila asked, her voice barely audible. Dominic didn't immediately answer. He kept his eyes on the road, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and steady. "We're going to the safe house," he said. "The one I told you about. It's off the grid. No one knows about it." Lila nodded, her mind racing. She had to trust him. There was no other choice. She looked over at the child, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, his small body curled up in the seat. He had no idea what was happening, but Lila would do whatever it took to protect him. She would fight, even if it meant running for the rest of her life. I won't let anything happen to him, she whispered to herself, her resolve strengthening. The road stretched out ahead of them, dark and uncertain, but for the first time in days, Lila felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could escape the nightmare that had been chasing them. The car continued on through the night, the city lights fading behind them as they headed into the unknown. The safe house was nothing like the mansion they had left behind. The air inside was cool, almost stale, and the dim light from a single lamp barely illuminated the room. It was small, far smaller than the luxurious space Lila had grown used to, but it felt secure. Lila stood by the door, her hand still holding tightly to the child's, her mind buzzing with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The child was already asleep, curled up on the couch, his small form seemingly untouched by the chaos that had turned their lives upside down. Lila watched him for a moment, taking in the innocence of his face as he slept. He didn't understand the danger, didn't know the weight of the world pressing down on them. But she did, and it was more than she could bear at times. Dominic sat across the room, his back to her, his body tense with the strain of the situation. He hadn't said much since they had arrived at the house, his eyes distant as if he were lost in thought. Lila wanted to approach him, to speak, but she knew better than to break his silence. He needed his space, just as much as she did. She knew that, even if the silence between them felt like a wall. After what felt like an eternity, Dominic finally turned, his eyes locking with hers. He had been holding something back, something important, but now it seemed he could no longer keep it to himself. "We have to leave," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "What do you mean?" Lila asked, her heart sinking. "We just got here. Where are we supposed to go?" Dominic stood, his posture straight, his face grim. "The safe house isn't safe anymore. They know we're here." Lila's heart pounded in her chest. "How?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. "I don't know," Dominic replied, his voice low. "But someone tipped them off. It's only a matter of time before they come looking for us." Lila swallowed hard, her throat dry. The fear that had been building up inside her now felt like a tangible thing, something she couldn't escape. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic walked over to her, his eyes locked on hers. "We move again," he said. "We go somewhere no one will find us. I'll make sure you're safe. I promise." Lila nodded, though doubt crept in. She had trusted Dominic before, but now, with everything closing in on them, she wasn't so sure. It was hard to keep her faith when every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into danger. "How do you know they won't find us again?" she asked. Dominic's gaze softened slightly, but his resolve remained unshaken. "Because I won't let them. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you, and him," he added, glancing at the child asleep on the couch. Lila felt a flicker of hope stir within her at his words. Dominic wasn't just some mafia boss. He was someone who had made a promise, and she had to believe that he would keep it. She didn't have many options, and right now, he was her only chance. She looked back at the child, her heart aching with love for him, but also with a deep, gnawing fear. He deserved a chance at a better life, one free from the shadow of violence and lies. And she would do whatever it took to give him that. "I trust you," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Dominic nodded. "I know you do. Now we have to move quickly." The plan was simple, at least in theory. They would leave the safe house immediately, head to a new location that Dominic had secured, and stay there until it was safe to move again. There was no time to waste. Lila gathered the child in her arms, trying to be as quiet as possible, though every movement felt like it was echoing in the stillness of the room. As they prepared to leave, Dominic went over the details of their escape one more time, checking every angle. "Stay close," he told Lila. "No matter what happens, stay with me. Understand?" Lila nodded, her eyes never leaving him. "I won't leave you," she promised. She could see the strain in his eyes, the burden he was carrying for both of them. But there was also something else, something softer, something human. It was a side of Dominic that she hadn't seen before, and it made her believe, if only for a moment, that maybe everything would be okay. The car ride was tense, the silence only broken by the occasional rustle of the child in Lila's arms. The streets outside were eerily quiet, the city fading into the distance as they made their way to the new location. The place was isolated, far from the prying eyes of the world, but it was also remote. Too remote for Lila's liking. But she didn't question it. She didn't have the luxury of questioning anything anymore. All she could do was follow Dominic's lead. When they arrived at the new house, Lila stepped out of the car, her feet feeling heavy as she walked toward the door. The house was modest, but it looked secure. Dominic had thought of everything. Inside, it was bare, just the essentials, nothing extravagant. A small living area, a single bedroom, and a few basic amenities. It wasn't much, but it was safe. For now, that had to be enough. As they settled in, Lila looked out the window, watching the sun set over the horizon. The weight of everything they had just gone through felt overwhelming. But in that moment, for the first time in what felt like forever, Lila allowed herself to breathe. They were safe, at least for now. But the thought nagged at her, the same thought that had been on her mind ever since they had started this journey. How long would it last? How long could they keep running before the past finally caught up with them? The new house felt quieter than the last. The isolation was both a comfort and a burden. Lila spent her days in a haze, moving through the motions of care, making sure the child was safe, fed, and entertained. The room he slept in was small, but it had been carefully set up, with soft blankets and a few toys she had bought on the way here. It was nothing extravagant, but it was home for now. Still, the weight of their situation never left her, a constant pressure in her chest. Dominic was always nearby, never far from her or the child. His presence was a constant reminder of the danger that loomed, but also a source of comfort. Every time she looked at him, she saw something different. A man who had shown her kindness when she thought no one would. It was hard for her to reconcile the ruthless boss she knew with the man who had promised to protect her. But she couldn't deny it. He was keeping his word. One evening, as the sun began to set, Dominic sat across from her, his usual cold demeanor softened. He hadn't spoken much that day, and neither had she. The silence between them felt more comfortable now, but it also carried a sense of impending change. Lila watched him closely as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "Lila," he said, breaking the silence, "we need to talk." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this moment, but that didn't make it any easier. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice low. Dominic's gaze met hers, his expression serious. "We can't keep running forever," he said, his words heavy with the reality of their situation. "Eventually, they'll find us." Lila felt her stomach tighten. She knew he was right, but hearing it from him made it feel more real. "What do you want to do?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Dominic stood, his hand running through his hair in frustration. "I don't have a choice. I need to make sure we're safe. But there's one thing I haven't told you." Lila's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "The people after us," Dominic said, his voice darkening. "They're not just anyone. They're connected to my past. People I thought I had left behind." Lila sat up, her pulse quickening. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've made a lot of enemies over the years, and they won't stop until they get what they want." He paused, his eyes clouded with regret. "I've always tried to protect you, Lila, but I'm afraid that may not be enough anymore." Lila stood, walking over to where he stood by the window. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice steady, though her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Dominic turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with a new intensity. "I'm going to confront them. I can't run anymore. It's time to end this, for good." Lila felt a knot tighten in her chest. "And what about us?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I mean, will we be okay?" Dominic stepped closer, his gaze softening. "You'll be safe. That's all that matters." He paused, then added, "I promise you." Lila's heart beat faster. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But fear still gnawed at her insides. She had seen enough of the world he came from to know that promises didn't always mean safety. But she had no choice now. She couldn't leave. Not now, not when they had come so far. "I trust you," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Dominic's expression softened as he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. "I won't let anything happen to you, or him. I'll protect you both, no matter what it takes." The sincerity in his voice made something inside her shift, a flicker of hope amidst the fear. She had come to depend on him more than she ever thought she would, and despite everything, she still believed in his words. Lila nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Dominic stepped back, his eyes scanning the room. "We leave in the morning," he said, his tone once again commanding. "We'll find a way to stop them before they get to us." Lila nodded again, though she wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. As the night stretched on, Lila sat in the dim light of the house, her thoughts racing. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let anything happen to the child, not as long as she had breath in her body. And if Dominic was going to face his past, she would be right there beside him. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The next morning arrived too soon for Lila, the weight of the night's conversation lingering in the back of her mind. Dominic had been quiet since their discussion, his usual stoic demeanor more pronounced. He had promised her they would leave, but he hadn't shared all the details yet, and she could feel the tension between them, thick and unspoken. She stood in the small, dimly lit kitchen of the house, stirring a pot of oatmeal for the child. He was still asleep, tucked safely in the small bedroom. Lila moved through the motions of breakfast, her mind on the looming unknown. She couldn't help but wonder about Dominic's plan. How would they escape the danger that seemed to be closing in on them? What was his next move? She tried to push the questions from her mind, focusing instead on the child who was now waking up, rubbing his eyes and yawning. Lila smiled softly as he ran to her, his tiny arms outstretched. "Good morning," she said, lifting him up and setting him on the counter next to the oatmeal. His small face lit up with a smile, and for a moment, Lila allowed herself to forget the danger that hovered in the distance. It was moments like these, quiet, simple moments, that made all the running, all the fear, seem worth it. But as the child began to eat, Lila's thoughts drifted back to the reality they were facing. Dominic's voice cut through her reverie, low and steady. "It's time to go," he said, standing in the doorway. His eyes were cold, but there was a determination there that Lila had come to recognize. She nodded, setting the spoon down and turning toward him. "Where are we going?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. Dominic's gaze softened, just a little. "A new place. It's secure, and no one knows about it." Lila swallowed, nodding as she gathered the child in her arms. It was clear that Dominic had everything planned, as usual, but the uncertainty still gnawed at her. She had learned to trust him, but the weight of their situation was overwhelming. She didn't know how much longer they could keep running, hiding, changing locations. How many more times could they move before someone found them? Dominic led them out of the house, and they climbed into the waiting car. The driver didn't ask any questions, simply pulling away from the curb as the house faded into the distance. Lila stared out the window, her mind racing. The city passed by in a blur, the familiar streets of their old life, now distant memories. She wasn't sure where they were going, but at this point, it hardly mattered. She was following Dominic, and she trusted him. But the nagging question remained. How long could they keep running? As the car turned onto a quiet street, Lila saw the outline of a building up ahead. It was small, unassuming, tucked away in the corner of a neighborhood she didn't recognize. "Here," Dominic said, breaking the silence. The car came to a stop, and the driver got out, opening the door for them. Dominic led the way into the building, his expression serious. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and Lila followed him through a narrow hallway, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. The building was modest, nothing like the grand homes they had left behind, but there was a sense of security here. It was simple, but it felt like a safe haven, hidden from the world outside. Dominic turned to her as they reached the stairs. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. Lila nodded, holding the child close as they climbed the stairs. They reached a door at the top, and Dominic knocked once, then pushed it open. Inside was a small, well-kept apartment, with just the essentials, a bed, a table, and a few chairs. Lila stepped inside, looking around. "This is it?" she asked, her voice unsure. Dominic nodded. "For now, it's enough to keep you safe." Lila felt a weight lift off her shoulders, but only slightly. The fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. She had learned not to get too comfortable, not to let herself believe that they were safe. Not yet. The child was already playing in the corner, oblivious to the weight of their circumstances. Lila watched him for a moment, her heart heavy with love and worry. She couldn't protect him from everything, but she would try her best. Dominic sat down at the table, his eyes scanning the room. "We'll stay here for a while," he said, his tone matter of fact. It's not perfect, but it'll do. Lila nodded, trying to take in everything that had happened. They were here, in a new place, with a temporary sense of safety. But how long would it last? She wanted to believe it would be enough, that they could stay hidden long enough for things to settle, for the danger to pass. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the reality they were living in. They were always one step ahead, always looking over their shoulders, always moving. And eventually, they would have to face the consequences of their past. Dominic stood up, his eyes meeting hers. I'll go make sure everything's secure, he said, his voice steady. Stay here with the child. Don't open the door for anyone. Lila nodded, her thoughts swirling as she watched him leave the apartment. She sat down on the bed, holding the child close. The silence in the room was deafening, but it felt like the calm before the storm. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Their lives would never be the same again. Lila sat quietly in the small apartment, the weight of the past few days pressing heavily on her shoulders. The child had fallen asleep in the corner, curled up on a pile of blankets, completely unaware of the danger that still loomed over them. She watched him for a moment, his small chest rising and falling in peaceful slumber, and a strange sense of peace washed over her. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that everything would be okay, that they would find safety here. But deep down, she knew better. The past had a way of catching up with them, and the enemies Dominic had warned her about were still out there. It was only a matter of time before they found them. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Dominic stepped inside, his expression grim. His eyes scanned the room before landing on her, and Lila could see the tension in his posture. He had been out for most of the morning, securing their location, making sure they were safe. But the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. We need to move, he said quietly, his voice filled with a heavy determination. Lila's heart sank. What happened? She asked, trying to steady her voice. Dominic closed the door behind him and walked over to where she sat. Someone found us, he replied, his tone clipped. It's not safe here anymore. Lila stood up, her mind racing. Who? She asked, fear creeping into her voice. Dominic didn't answer immediately. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. I'm not sure yet, he said. But it's only a matter of time before they show up. We have to go. Lila felt a rush of panic in her chest. She had just started to feel safe, just started to believe they might actually have a chance. But now, everything was slipping away again. Where do we go? She asked, her voice trembling. Dominic's eyes softened, but his expression remained serious. I've arranged a new place. It's more secure than this one. We'll be there for a while until things settle down. Lila nodded, though she didn't feel reassured. Every time they moved, it felt like they were one step closer to being trapped, with nowhere left to run. She glanced at the child, who was still asleep, his small face relaxed and innocent. He had no idea what was happening. He had no idea that they were always running, always hiding. Dominic stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. Stay close, he said softly. We'll make it through this, I promise. Lila wanted to believe him. She really did. But the fear gnawing at her insides told her otherwise. She knew better than to think they could outrun the past forever. They couldn't keep running, not without facing what they had left behind. They needed a solution, and Dominic's promises only went so far. She had seen too many people broken by promises. Lila grabbed a bag, quickly throwing in the child's belongings, her own few essentials, and anything she could grab in the moment. She was used to moving quickly by now, but this time it felt different. This time, there was no escape. Dominic was already at the door, waiting for her, his face set in determination. As she walked toward him, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, a flicker of something human, something vulnerable. For a moment, she wondered if he was feeling the same weight she was carrying. Are you ready? He asked, his voice soft but firm. Lila nodded, though her heart was heavy. Ready, she said, though she wasn't sure she was. They stepped out into the hallway, and Dominic closed the door behind them. The building, small and quiet, was eerily still. It felt like they were walking through the calm before a storm, the quietness almost deafening in its silence. As they made their way down the stairs, Lila's mind kept racing. Where would they go? Would this new place be any safer than the last? And how much longer could they keep running before it all caught up with them? They reached the car, and the driver was already waiting, the engine running quietly in the background. Dominic opened the door for Lila and the child, and they climbed in, the door closing softly behind them. The car pulled away from the building, and Lila watched as the city faded into the distance. The streets outside were empty, the buildings a blur as they sped through the night. The silence in the car was suffocating, but it was better than the tension that had been building ever since they had arrived at the first safe house. Lila didn't speak, didn't know what to say. She couldn't bring herself to ask questions she knew didn't have answers. Dominic sat in the front, his eyes focused on the road, his jaw clenched with determination. He wasn't saying much, but Lila could feel the pressure in the air. The same pressure that had followed them from the moment they left the mansion. The same pressure that had never truly gone away. The city passed by in the dark, and Lila felt the weight of the past few weeks press in on her chest. She was running out of places to hide, running out of time to outrun the life she had left behind. But as the car turned down a narrow street, she felt something shift. Maybe it was the way Dominic held himself, the way he looked at her with that soft but resolute expression. Maybe it was the promise in his voice. Maybe it was just that, for the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope. The car rolled to a stop in front of a new house, a small, nondescript place that seemed to blend into its surroundings. The neighborhood was quiet, and the houses, though modest, were well kept. It wasn't the kind of place Dominic would normally choose, but for now, it would do. The weight of the last few days hung heavy in the air. Lila felt the tension in her chest as they climbed out of the car, clutching the child's hand as they made their way to the front door. She could feel Dominic's presence beside her, but he was silent, his usual commanding demeanor replaced by something darker, more guarded. He had done everything he could to keep them safe, but she could see the strain in his eyes. This was not the life either of them had planned. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside. The space was small but functional, a single room with a kitchen nook, a couch, and a bedroom area off to the side. It was sparse, but it had everything they needed to get by. Lila set the child down on the couch, watching as he immediately began exploring the new space. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll the constant moving had taken on both of them. She wanted to comfort him, to reassure him that they were safe, but the fear in her own heart made it hard to say anything convincing. Dominic closed the door behind them and locked it securely, as if reinforcing the small bubble of safety they had found. He looked at Lila, his expression unreadable. "We'll stay here for now," he said, his voice low but firm. Lila nodded, though she didn't feel reassured. Every new place they went to felt like a temporary solution, a fleeting moment of safety before the storm inevitably came again. She had been through this too many times before. "What happens next?" she asked quietly. Dominic ran a hand through his hair, his eyes flickering with a mixture of frustration and resolve. "Next, we plan," he said. "I'm not running anymore. We need to deal with this, once and for all." Lila looked at him, her heart heavy. "What does that mean? How do we stop them?" "We stop them by taking the fight to them," Dominic replied, his gaze unwavering. "I've been running my whole life, and now it's time to put an end to it. I won't let anyone threaten you, or him, any longer." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen him this determined, this resolute. It was clear that whatever he had been holding back was about to come to the surface. She could see it in his eyes. This was a man who had been pushed to his limit, and she wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. "But how?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic looked at her, his eyes dark with the weight of his decisions. "I've got connections. People who owe me," he said. "I'll make sure no one gets close to you again." Lila nodded, though the fear in her chest didn't quite subside. She trusted him, but the stakes were higher than ever. They had crossed a line, and she didn't know what that meant for them. As Dominic moved around the small room, preparing for whatever lay ahead, Lila sat still, her thoughts racing. She had never wanted this life. She had never wanted to be a part of the world Dominic came from. But here she was, caught in the middle of it, trying to protect the child, trying to survive. The life she had known was gone, replaced by a world of danger, deception, and uncertainty. She had no choice now but to follow Dominic, to place her trust in him, even though every instinct told her that they were treading a dangerous path. The child, oblivious to the weight of the world on their shoulders, continued to play, as if the dangers outside the door were of no consequence. Lila's heart ached as she watched him. She had promised to protect him, to keep him safe, but she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep that promise. How could she shield him from a world that never stopped coming for them? Dominic finished what he was doing and turned back to Lila, his eyes hard with resolve. "We're doing this my way, Lila," he said. "No more hiding. No more running." She met his gaze, her throat tight with emotion. "I just want him to be safe," she whispered. Dominic's expression softened for the briefest moment, and he nodded. "I know," he said quietly. "I won't let anyone hurt him. Or you." But Lila could hear the uncertainty in his voice, even though he tried to hide it. She could see the weight of his past, the burden he carried with him every day. And she knew that no matter how much he wanted to protect them, there were forces in the world that were bigger than him. The world outside their small sanctuary was still out there, waiting. And Lila didn't know how long it would be before it came crashing down around them again. As the night stretched on, Lila sat in silence, the child finally drifting off to sleep in her arms. She held him tightly, unwilling to let go, even as her mind raced with the uncertainty of their future. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope, just a little. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of this alive. But deep down, she knew the price of that hope, and she was terrified of what they would have to pay to survive. The days blurred together after Dominic's decision to confront the people who had been chasing them. Lila spent most of her time with the child, trying to keep his world small and safe, while Dominic handled things outside of their temporary sanctuary. She had seen the determination in his eyes when he made that promise, but it had come with a weight, a burden he hadn't fully shared with her. The silence between them grew, not because of distrust, but because they both knew what was coming. She could feel the walls closing in, and it made every moment feel fragile, like they were just waiting for the inevitable crash. One afternoon, as the child napped in the corner of the room, Lila sat by the window, staring out into the gray sky. Her thoughts were clouded with worry, but something else lingered beneath that, something she had been avoiding acknowledging. She had never been part of Dominic's world, never understood the depths of the violence and the lies. But now, it was a part of her life, a reality she couldn't escape. The past few days had been full of tension, but also an odd sense of normalcy. For a few fleeting moments, she had allowed herself to believe that they might actually be safe, that they could find a life outside of the constant fear. But deep down, she knew that this couldn't last. Dominic was right. They couldn't keep running. And now, the only choice was to face it head on. The door opened, pulling Lila from her thoughts. Dominic stepped inside, his face harder than usual. His eyes met hers, and she immediately saw the change. There was no time left for pretending. It was happening now. "We have to move," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Lila stood up, her heart skipping a beat. "What happened?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Dominic didn't say anything for a moment, his gaze fixed on the child, who was still asleep. "They know where we are," he said quietly. "I'm not going to let them get to you, but we can't stay here anymore." Lila felt the blood drain from her face. It wasn't a surprise, but hearing it out loud made the reality hit harder. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice tight. Dominic met her gaze, his eyes filled with determination. "I have a place," he replied. "It's secure. We'll be there for as long as we need." Lila nodded, though uncertainty still lingered. "How long do we have?" she asked, her mind racing. Dominic's jaw tightened, his gaze darkening. "Not long," he said simply. "We leave now." Without waiting for another word, he turned and headed for the door. Lila grabbed the child, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no choice but to follow Dominic, to trust that he had everything under control. She had no idea what was waiting for them, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. They had already lost too much. They reached the car in silence. Lila could feel the weight of the decision in every step they took, as if the very act of moving forward sealed their fate. The driver was already there, waiting for them, and they quickly climbed into the back. The car started up, and Lila watched as the world outside sped by. The city they had left behind was fading, and they were heading into the unknown. Dominic sat in the front, his expression set, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Lila could feel the tension in the air, the palpable fear that neither of them spoke about, but both could feel. They were both running out of time. They drove for what felt like hours, the streets blurring together. Lila couldn't stop thinking about what Dominic had said. about making sure they were safe. She didn't know what that meant or how he planned to do it, but she had to believe that he could protect them. It was the only thing she had left to hold on to. After what felt like an eternity, the car finally slowed, and Dominic turned to her. "We're here," he said quietly. Lila looked out the window and saw the new location, a small, unassuming building in a quiet part of town. It was far removed from the chaos of the city, far removed from the life they had been running from. Dominic stepped out of the car first, and Lila followed, holding the child tightly in her arms. They entered the building, and Lila felt an uneasy calm settle over her. This place was different. It didn't have the same feeling of danger that had followed them everywhere else. For the first time in a while, Lila allowed herself to breathe. Dominic led them up the stairs, and they reached a small apartment, nothing extravagant, just simple and functional. Lila looked around, trying to gauge how long they could stay here. It was the safest place they had been in days, but the question still lingered. How long could they stay safe? Dominic locked the door behind them and turned to her. "Stay here with the child," he said. "I'll take care of the rest." Lila nodded, but something in her stirred. She couldn't just sit idly by while Dominic faced whatever was coming. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice firm. Dominic's eyes met hers, his expression softening for the first time in days. "You don't have to," he said, his voice low. "You're safer here." Lila shook her head. "No, I'm with you. We face this together." Dominic looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. He didn't argue, didn't try to stop her. "Stay close," he said, his voice full of quiet determination. "And keep him safe." As they stepped out into the hall, Lila's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about facing the consequences of everything they had done, everything they had been running from. And no matter what happened, she wasn't going to let Dominic face it alone. The tension in the small apartment was almost unbearable. Lila could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She had never been this close to the edge before, never been so aware of how fragile their world had become. Dominic was pacing, his movements sharp, every gesture filled with a sense of urgency. He had a plan, but she knew that it was all coming to a head. The past few weeks had been a constant game of cat and mouse, and now, they were no longer running. They were preparing for a final confrontation. Lila stood by the window, watching the street below. The usual noise of the city had faded into a tense silence, and her mind raced with all the possible outcomes. She had always been a quiet observer of Dominic's world, but now she was at the heart of it. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about everything they had built, everything they had fought for. The child was asleep in the corner, still unaware of the chaos that was unfolding. Lila's heart ached as she looked at him. He deserved a life filled with joy and peace, not the fear and uncertainty they were living with. She had promised to protect him, but the weight of that promise was becoming heavier with every passing moment. Dominic stopped pacing and turned to face her. His eyes were filled with a determination she had never seen before. "We leave in an hour," he said, his voice steady. "I've made the arrangements. We won't be here long." Lila nodded, her mind still processing everything. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic's jaw tightened as he looked out the window. "To end this," he said simply. "We're going to face them head on. No more running." Lila's heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "You don't have to do this alone." "I can." "No." Dominic interrupted, his tone firm. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about you and him. You've been part of this world now, and we need to finish what we started." Lila felt a surge of emotion, a mix of fear and admiration. She had never imagined that the life she had stumbled into would lead her to this moment. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let Dominic face this alone. "I'm with you," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever happens, we're in this together." Dominic met her gaze, his eyes softening for just a moment before the walls came back up. He nodded. "I know," he said quietly, "and that's why we'll make it through this. I won't let anything happen to you or him." The finality in his words struck Lila deep. She wanted to believe him, to trust that they could survive this, but part of her wondered if this was the last step in a journey that had no return. She had seen how ruthless Dominic could be, but she also saw the cracks beneath the surface, the man who was willing to protect them at any cost. Lila had learned the hard way that promises in his world didn't always hold up, but she had to trust him now. She had to believe that they could make it out. They spent the next few minutes gathering their things, preparing for what was to come. Dominic had already packed most of their essentials, his expression focused, as if nothing could shake him now. Lila grabbed the child's bag in her own, and they moved quietly through the apartment, the sound of their footsteps too loud in the silence. Once they were ready, they walked out into the hall, where the driver was waiting for them. The car was already running, its engine humming in the quiet. Dominic held the door open for Lila, his eyes scanning the street one last time. "Stay close," he said, his voice low, but laced with urgency. Lila climbed into the car, the child in her arms, and Dominic followed. As the car pulled away, the familiar streets of the city disappeared behind them, swallowed by the night. Lila felt the weight of the moment press on her, the fear of the unknown gripping her heart. She wanted to ask where they were going, what the next step was, but she already knew. Dominic had been planning this for days, maybe even longer. He had the connections, the power to make things happen. But at what cost? Lila looked at him, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions, but she stayed silent. The answer didn't matter now. All that mattered was getting through this alive. "How long will it take?" Lila asked after a few minutes of silence. Dominic's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, his face hardening. "It won't take long," he said. "We're getting close to the end. Once this is over, you and him will be safe." Lila nodded, her hands tightening around the child. She had to believe that. She had to believe that they would make it out, no matter what happened next. The car continued to move through the night, the city lights growing dimmer and dimmer as they approached their destination. Lila's heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her focus. On Dominic, on the promise he had made. No matter what it took, they would survive this. They had no other choice. The car pulled up to the hidden warehouse, its exterior dark and unassuming, tucked away in the industrial district on the outskirts of the city. Lila's heart beat faster as the vehicle came to a stop, the weight of what was about to happen sinking in. She could feel the tension in the air, thick with the uncertainty of their next steps. Dominic had been quiet during the ride, his eyes focused on the road ahead, his jaw clenched in determination. He had been the one driving them forward, taking them into this unknown territory, but now, even he seemed to feel the gravity of what was about to unfold. As the car doors opened, Lila stepped out first, holding the child close to her chest. The cool night air hit her face, and she glanced around, noticing the silence that hung over the area. There were no signs of life, no movement from the shadows. It felt like the calm before the storm. Dominic led them toward the warehouse entrance, the heavy steel door looming ahead. He didn't say a word, but gestured for Lila to follow. She stayed close, every step measured, her instincts on high alert. The child had no idea what was going on. To him, it was just another change in their routine, another unfamiliar place. Lila wished she could make him understand that this was the last move they would make, that once they got inside, they would be safe. But she knew the truth. Safety was an illusion in their world. As they reached the door, Dominic pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked it, the creak of the door echoing through the empty space. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, filled with rows of metal shelves stacked high with boxes and crates. It had the sterile, cold feeling of a place meant for business, not for living. But this was the place that Dominic had arranged for them, the place where they would face their enemies. Dominic moved quickly, stepping inside and making his way toward the back of the building. Lila followed, the child still in her arms, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood and metal. It felt like a prison, and the thought made her stomach tighten. They were about to confront the people who had been chasing them, the people Dominic had promised to take down. She couldn't help but wonder what that would mean for them. What would be left of their lives when the dust finally settled? As they reached a small, secured room at the back of the warehouse, Dominic turned to Lila, his eyes steely with determination. "Stay here with him," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'll deal with them." Lila shook her head, her grip tightening on the child. "I'm not staying behind," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing the decision. Finally, he nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. He had always known that she wouldn't back down, that she would be by his side no matter what. "Stay close then," he said. "And don't do anything stupid." Lila didn't respond. Instead, she followed him into the room, which was filled with a large conference table and a few chairs. The air was tense, filled with the weight of the confrontation ahead. Dominic stood at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the empty space as he waited. Lila stood beside him, the child still in her arms, his small face peaceful and unaware of the dangers surrounding them. Moments later, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, and the door to the room opened. In walked two men, their expressions cold and calculating, their eyes focused on Dominic. Lila felt her heart race as they stepped inside, their presence almost suffocating. The men looked like they belonged to a world that Lila had only seen from a distance, a world of power, of violence, and of ruthless ambition. "You've been hard to reach," one of them said, his voice low and controlled. "We didn't expect you to come to us so soon." Dominic didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unwavering. "I'm done running," he said. "This ends tonight." The second man laughed, a cruel sound that sent a chill through the room. "You think you're in control here?" he sneered. "You think you can just show up and demand what's yours?" Dominic stepped forward, his body tense with suppressed fury. "I'm not asking for anything," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm taking what's mine, and you're in my way." The men exchanged a glance, their faces hardening. The tension in the room grew, thickening with every passing second. Lila could feel the unease creeping up her spine, the realization that this was about to get ugly, and there would be no turning back. The first man reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a gun and placing it on the table with a deliberate motion. Lila's heart stopped for a moment. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just about survival. This was about something much bigger. The child stirred in her arms, his innocent gaze catching her eye, and for a moment, Lila found herself wishing that he could stay this way forever, unaware, untouched by the violence that had been chasing them. But that wasn't the world they lived in. The world outside their small bubble was harsh, unforgiving, and relentless. The men at the table weren't going to back down, and neither was Dominic. She could feel the storm brewing, and she had no idea how it would end. But in that moment, standing in the dimly lit warehouse with the child in her arms and Dominic at her side, Lila made a silent vow. No matter what happened, she would protect him. She would protect them both, even if it meant facing the storm head-on. The room was tense, the silence stretching on longer than it should have. Lila could feel the child shifting in her arms, his small face still peaceful, unaware of the danger that hung over them. Dominic stood at the table, facing the two men who had entered, his posture stiff and unyielding. The air was thick with the weight of the confrontation. The men didn't seem surprised by Dominic's presence. They didn't flinch when he spoke. It was as if this was a moment they had expected, and now it was time to settle the score. One of the men, the taller one, picked up the gun from the table, his fingers grazing it, as if it were a casual thing, as if it didn't represent the stakes of the life-and-death battle they were about to engage in. "So, you're done running," he said, his voice low, a sneer tugging at the corner of his lips. "And you think this will end in your favor?" Dominic's gaze hardened, his eyes never leaving the man's. "I'm not here for a fight," he said, his voice steady but filled with cold resolve. "I'm here to take what's mine, and to end this. I'm done being your pawn." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Lila felt a chill creep down her spine. She could see the way Dominic stood, the way he was preparing to do whatever it took to make sure they were safe, to make sure they could have a future, no matter the cost. She wanted to scream, to tell him to stop, to run away and hide one more time, but she couldn't. She had already come so far with him. They had no more places to run to. "You think you can walk away from this?" the second man asked, his voice colder now. "You don't get to make demands." Dominic's eyes flashed with anger, but his voice remained calm. "I've made demands my whole life, but not anymore. Now, I'm taking back control. This ends now." The man with the gun smirked, taking a step forward, his finger resting on the trigger. "You really believe you have control, don't you?" Lila's heart pounded in her chest as the tension escalated. She could feel the child starting to stir again, his small hands reaching out for her. She adjusted her grip, her eyes never leaving Dominic, trying to maintain her focus. The seconds stretched on, each one dragging like an eternity. She knew that this moment would define everything. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. The taller man laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed in the room. "This is it then," he said. "The great Dominic Castellano's last stand." Dominic didn't flinch. His resolve remained unwavering. "This isn't my last stand," he said. "This is the end of your empire." The words hung in the air, thick with the promise of something far greater than just a simple confrontation. It was the end of everything that had been built on lies, manipulation, and violence. The tension in the room was unbearable now, the weight of what was happening pressing down on Lila's chest. She glanced at Dominic, her heart racing. He was ready for whatever came next. He had made it clear that he wouldn't back down, no matter the cost. But she didn't know if she could follow him down this path. She didn't know if she could be a part of the world he was about to destroy. The second man took a step forward, raising his hand to signal the end of the confrontation. But just as he moved, Dominic acted. In a blur of motion, he reached for the gun, his hand faster than the man's could react. The sound of the gunshot rang out in the small room, echoing in Lila's ears. The second man collapsed to the ground, his body hitting the floor with a thud. Lila gasped, her hand instinctively going to cover the child's ears. The room was filled with the heavy sound of breathing, the silence that followed almost deafening. The first man stood frozen, his eyes wide in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Dominic's eyes locked on his expression hardening even further. "You're not in control anymore," he said, his voice cold. The first man's expression shifted, his confidence wavering for the first time. He glanced at the body of his fallen comrade, and then back at Dominic, who stood in front of him with a quiet, deadly certainty. The tension in the room had broken, but it had only been replaced by something darker, more dangerous. "You can walk away now," Dominic said, his voice low. "Or you can try to stop me. But make no mistake, I'm not leaving here without what I came for." The man's gaze flicked to the door, then back to Dominic. The realization that he was outmatched was written all over his face. Slowly, the man lowered his weapon, the fight draining out of him. He had been playing a dangerous game, but it was clear now that Dominic had already won. "You've made your point," the man said, his voice tight. "We'll leave you in peace." Dominic nodded, his eyes still cold, still unyielding. "I don't want peace," he said. "I want control. And now I have it." The man turned and quickly left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The door closed behind him with a finality that felt like a door closing on an entire chapter of their lives. Lila stood there, frozen, her hands still trembling as she held the child in her arms. Dominic turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "It's over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to feel. But she knew that things had changed, forever. Their world would never be the same again. But for the first time in a long while, they had a future. And that was all that mattered. In the world of captivating romance stories, two lives intertwine in a dangerous and unpredictable journey. As a mafia boss and a humble Maid find themselves on the run, they must navigate through life-threatening obstacles and uncover buried secrets. Their deep connection is tested as they face betrayal, survival, and a battle for control. This gripping tale unfolds as they confront their pasts and the enemies chasing them, proving that love and loyalty can thrive even in the darkest of circumstances. Romance stories like this draw you in, filled with tension, heartache, and moments of unexpected tenderness. Amidst the chaos, the strength of their bond is undeniable, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful love stories emerge when two people fight for each other, no matter the cost. As their journey continues, they realize that nothing is more precious than protecting the ones you love, making this one of the most unforgettable romance stories ever told.